In this video, I'm going to talk about why it's crucial to have a point of overlap when you're practicing in sections, how to expand from smaller into larger sets over time, which is what I call like the sections with overlap in my logical methodology, and how spaced repetition is critical to expansion. And also I'll explain some of my notational system, some of the fundamentals and basics of the method, and in general how it's very much about figuring out what you can do and then just doing a ton of that. So first, in terms of what I call sets overall, it's a very easy concept. I just wanted to call them something so that we didn't have to constantly refer to it as just a section and then the following note or chord. But I'm going to use River Flows in You here because I think a lot of people know this piece. I've been teaching this since I was a teenager, I think. So, for instance, the stars here, these would represent what I call like one measure set markers. And, like I said, they're just called sets. So a one measure set would literally be from star to star, like you played this entire measure and then you played just one more note or one more chord of the next beat. Of the next measure, that is. Or, for instance, here, if you played here one measure plus just the following chord here of the next measure, that would be a one measure set. So it really is just a certain section plus the following vertical. Sometimes I call it a vertical because it could be either a single note or more than one note, which would be a chord. And over here, I put these triangles. These would be half measure set markers. And, musicians out there, of course, it really just means first to third beat here or third to first beat. But, when teaching, I do like to clarify, it's really just this half of the measure plus this vertical here. Maybe I should use a smaller highlighting option. So that would be the case there. If we did like a two measure set, for instance, it might be from like here to like over here. So just two measures plus the following vertical and so on. So so in general, these are what I'll refer to as sets. In terms of their expansion, it's really important that basically you figure out what it is that you can solve easily or that you can play easily. And then I mentioned earlier, you just start doing a lot of whatever that is. So I think in starting some of these little lectures, it's probably easier to just talk about both hand sets first. Maybe in the future, I'll start talking about how separate hand sets relate and how separate hand sets can lead into both hand sets and so on. But just for simplicity's sake for now, I'm not going to go into separate hand practice or the adding and reverse principle that I've already talked about a bunch of times. So let's say, for example, here, if you asked a student to play, or you yourself played, assuming that you're not a high-level pianist just yet, this four measure set, right? Let's say that you wanted to play from here all the way to over here. For a lot of students, that would be too difficult right off the bat. They're going to start practicing and then immediately they're going to run into inefficiencies as a result of trying a section that's too large. So you have to figure out what is it that the student can actually do quite easily. Is it a two measure set? Like, would they play from here to like over here, for instance? Or would even that be too difficult? It might actually even be like a half measure set. So, for instance, you just want them to play from this triangle to this triangle over here. And if in this thought experiment they are able to do this, like they are able to play like from this spot to this spot, or you're able to yourself, then you would mark here a half. So in this notational system, we use these little curly brackets, kind of like this thing on the side of the grand staff, just to show what kind of set it is that you've just played. So for instance, this part is just half of a measure plus the following beat. So all we do is directly over the starting point, we've put these funny little curly brackets and we just write half right here. Same thing from here to here. If you play like from this spot to this spot correctly, then you would just mark a half within these funny brackets, and then you'd keep going from here. Now, in this example, this measure obviously is a lot easier than the previous ones, so most likely you would just do like the one measure set pretty easily. Mark the one here, and then move on, and then maybe over here again you play from here to here. Now, just to be clear, for right now, I'm not really explaining exactly how it is that we like solve this, so to speak. Like, how do you actually end up playing from here to here? It really is not typically that you'll just do it over and over again. But for the sake of not creating an hour-long video, let's just assume that the solution is pretty straightforward, and I can go over other solutions in the future. So you would kind of just continue in this way. Now, when I'm writing these little indications, it really just means I'm doing it correctly once and then just moving on. So this is, if you haven't seen some of my earlier, I talk about spaced repetition a little bit in one of them, and this is really about just the moving on, not doing mass practice, not doing it over and over again. And this will seem very counterintuitive. Like, you hear protests immediately, like, well, I don't really have it, I don't really remember it, oh, I just came back to it and I've forgotten it. But like I mentioned in earlier videos, this forgetting is really highly desirable, and we won't really be able to fight it. Instead, we should use it to our advantage, have purposeful forgetting and relearning, like I mentioned in a previous video. So basically, once you get it correct, even just once, to your standard, and the standard is debatable, but let's assume it's just like a good, healthy touch with at least the notes, rhythm, correct, stable tempo, stable, preferably in the memory, for instance, if you want to play it from memory in the end. And then you just mark the symbol and you just move on. And you don't look back. Like, if you solve a half measure set in the beginning here, and then you solve another half measure set over here, don't be one of those people that then tries to link it into a one right away. Or if you solve a half and maybe one, don't try to link it together into a two right away. You have to allow some time to pass. So let's say that you keep going. Now, this part here, when I talk about doing what you can do, I mean, this measure is obviously way more difficult than the beginning. And in fact, truthfully speaking, if I were coaching like a beginner through this piece, which is pretty common because I'm able to use the methodology to get them to advance a lot quicker, they're almost certainly going to have to practice this separate hands and not even attempt both hand sets yet. But like I mentioned earlier, let's just assume both hand sets for this experiment, this thought experiment now, for the sake of a shorter video. So let's assume that you can solve quarter measure sets. This would mean you can play from circle to circle, right? A quarter of a measure plus the following beat, and then you just move on to the next part. And then again, circle to circle, just this part. If you can play that correctly, you mark a quarter and just keep going. Circle to circle here, mark a quarter, keep going. You notice here that I actually drew like 8th measure set markers and even 16th measure set markers. So if we get more into granular detail in the future, I can kind of explain how to use these tiny sections. And then again, you might pass this quarter over here. Okay, so now some time has passed. You could keep solving these. You could just keep doing quarters. So if you are teaching, or if I'm teaching, basically I figure out what it is that the student can do. Let's say that I determined during the lesson they can solve these quarter measure sets. I'm just going to make sure that they can solve them, and then just ask them to do a ton more of that, right? Because I have evidence that they can solve sections that are this small. I have no evidence that they can do, let's say, half measure sets in this section. They don't have the problem solving skills to piece it together into ones or twos. So my assignment is just going to be just go home and just do a ton of this. It's as if you're giving yourself a lesson every day. Like tomorrow, just solve a whole bunch more quarter measure sets. And I find that almost all of the time it's a mindset issue here that prevents them from just doing a ton of quarter measure sets by the next time. Even though I try to be as clear as I can, many times they'll come back the next week and they'll say, oh, I've only actually practiced like 3 measures or 2 measures, because they've still somehow misunderstood that they should just do a ton of what it is that they can do. So having gained experience all these years, I try to spell it out even more clearly by just preemptively telling that story. Like, oh, you don't want to be one of those people that only practices 2 measures by the following week. Don't worry about linking it together. We will figure that out next time or the time after. Just keep solving quarters, for instance, if those are the types of sections that you can figure out on your own. And let's say that I do that for a little bit longer. So let's say I solve some more quarters here. If we go back to the beginning, some time has passed, and this would be the opportune time to then do this one, like from here to there. Because some time has elapsed, this has had time to be forgotten, and you're going to have to spend some effort to relearn it. So now's the time to increase this to a 1, for instance. This one's already a 1, so maybe we'll just move on to the next part. Probably over here, you can do the same thing. You add halves here. Now you can do from here to here. You can write this 1. So one of the principles in the methodology is that if there are 2 adjacent sets of the same size, you must try to increase to the next order of magnitude the following time. So for instance, there were already 1s here, so we'll just move on. And then here there's 2 quarters next to each other. As in, again, previously you'd played like from here to here correctly, you marked that. You played from here to here correctly, you marked that. So then this time we're going to expand and play, from triangle to triangle. We're going to combine them together and then mark a half here. Same thing for here. Like we're going to end up playing from here to here, combine these 2 quarters into a half measure set. And what I'll hint here is that the add principle that I'll cover probably more in depth in a future video, and other strategies are going to be relevant. Doing separate and both hands is going to be relevant, but this is just kind of a simplified top level view of the method here. So this piece is a little bit complex because there are like quarters, halves, like there's different difficulties of section and so on. But overall, if the piece is the same difficulty all the way through, you could think of it as solving like quarter measure sets all the way through the full piece or the full page. And then you could do halves through everything sometime later. Then you could do 1s through everything. Then you could do 2s through everything. And when I say solving, which is just a habit really, it really just means playing the section correctly and correctly once to your standard. So I think in terms of doing what you can do, let me make sure I've covered everything in my little list here. So yeah, in practicing as well, for instance, with the new piece, I could maybe do like a 4 measure set or something right off the bat, but I have to ask myself, is this really the most efficient? It might be, but if it's a piece that's complicated for me, even if I can do it a 4 measure set fairly quickly, perhaps I can do 1 measure sets, but do them really rapidly. And this is like the sweet spot for my progress. It's not something that's mind-numbingly easy, but it's not something that's going to take, 15, 20 minutes. Instead, maybe it's something that can take like 2 minutes or something. And I can just crank out 1 measure sets, just play, from star to star, each measure very rapidly, pass them, don't look back. And then later when I come back, I can then start to expand to 2s and to 4s and so on. And even if the amount of time that it takes, instead of just doing a 4 measure set outright, for me to do 1s, then I come back later, and then I do 2s, then I come back later, and then I do the 4s. Even if the number of minutes of actual practice is longer, it almost certainly will still end up saving me a ton of time because it's already going through spaced repetition So the section has already been consolidated in my long-term memory much more. I've been forced to make more observations because I've started from a lot of different spots. So really in my practice, I'm just trying to determine, again, what is it that I can do the most efficiently, and then just relentlessly execute. Just get a ton of it done. Same thing with teaching, like I mentioned earlier. Like the student, you may be able to piece together a larger section with them in the lesson, but instead, how about simplifying it further? How about instead of the one measure set, have them do quarter measure sets, or have them do half measure, like separate hand sets. Again, I'll talk about separate hand sets in the future, I think. And then once you've determined they can do that, just have them do a ton of that. And honestly, it's the same thing in business as well. I'm not going to go into a huge long thought here, but essentially business is a lot about just determining what it is that's going to help you, what's going to move things forward, eliminating everything else that's unnecessary. And once you've determined what works, what's going to move the business or move the process or move the system forward, just invest everything into that. Just do a ton of that. And anything that doesn't help that, get it out of the way. So I find as the studio has expanded that, again, there's more parallels between these different worlds. And I find that our thinking in many different subjects, whether it be teaching or business or learning or whatever your most random interests seem to be, it's not really just an empty like metaphor or allegory or like a vague comparison between them, or a nice platitude that you find. These ways of thinking will definitely help each other and cause your thoughts to transform into something unique, something creative, something that'll add value, as long as you're providing any kind of service. And if you're not, then it'll add a great deal of value to your own learning and to your own independent thinking. So yeah, hope some of this is helpful. And if it is, then please like and subscribe and leave in the comments below what you think and anything else you'd like me to talk about. Yeah, looking forward to next week again.